I just mentioned, my condolences, and you said, don't worry, I'm the happiest bloke you'll meet here today.
We belong to a God who promises healings and miracles and guarantees death. You can see them reaching for their Bibles and scriptures to correct this person. I said, stop. I said, it's official. God doesn't exist. They packed about 10 years of love into 15 months of marriage. And then cancer hit because she was on drugs that lowered her immune system to retain the organ that had been transplanted into her body. And within about 2 weeks, she was in heaven. Because grieving people live in a bitter world. And so feeling a bit of happiness and laughing is kind of like a reminder of what I used to be like and what life could be like in the future.
Welcome to another episode of Good Grief. Today I'm joined by my friend David Schaeffer, and this conversation has been in the making now for, I would say probably years. We just didn't know it.
That's right.
But in reality, probably about 6 weeks or so now, Dave, myself and Kaylee caught up after we returned from a trip to Melbourne, up on a little rooftop near the airport. The sun was setting. We had a coffee and a great chat. But we actually go back a little bit further than just more recently when we've caught up over common interests, especially being grief.
Yeah.
There's a lot more there. But your son and I drummed together for years at church. I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't know that.
So
I know he loves drumming.
there you go. So yeah, we hung out a whole bunch and had a ton of fun over the years. And now here we are. Hanging out. So
Father and son.
yeah. And so today's, it's been interesting. Today we are going to dive into quite a number of things, but one question that's been on our, or come from our audience quite a lot is how do you deal with multiple losses? And so I think today's conversation is really going to set that up and help a lot of people through that journey. And so it's great to have you on the show. I've been looking forward to this for 6 weeks. And welcome.
Likewise.
When we did meet for a coffee, it was a great chat. And I asked you, would you like to jump on and have a chat? And you said yes, but read my book first and then let's have a chat. So I've finished the book in record time. Probably just because it's a small book.
It's not a huge contribution to the literary libraries of the world, is it?
But that's nice when you're going through grief.
Yeah.
Not a textbook, not a journal of sorts. It's a small, easy book. But what I like to do, and for everyone listening, this might be something that's helpful that I learnt from somebody on Instagram, funnily enough, is as I read books, I love getting pens out and just getting messy and underlining and putting notes.
Me too.
And then at the start of the book, this is what I learnt on the front cover. When you pick up something, I just note down the little side note or aha or lesson and what page it's on in the front cover.
Yeah, right.
So you can see there.
Yeah.
Probably can't see on camera, but filled up the front cover full of little anecdotes, lessons and ahas.
It's clever.
So I didn't come up with it. I would claim it if it was mine, but it's not. But I'm thrilled to have you here. And I'd like to kick off just by learning a bit about, or sharing with the audience a little bit about David Schaeffer, and just a bit of background before we jump into things. How do you like to break it down for everyone?
The immediate thought is that I'm now 74 and I've had a massive number of experiences in life. And you've just given me the opportunity to not let you ask another question. Look, shorthand. Born again in 1968 at a Billy Graham crusade.
I love that. Just like my dad, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it was 68 or he came in 70. He came twice to Australia.
No, more than that.
Did he?
59, 68,
Okay, would have been
70s.
Yeah, it would have been in the 70s.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I think much like yourself, he didn't know what he was doing there. And he was up the back and he just felt called down the front.
Oh, look, I only went because a pretty girl invited me.
I think that would have been the same for my dad.
However, I'd always believed in God. But when Billy Graham gave the appeal, my heart nearly beat out of my chest. And I was really awestruck because I hadn't been listening to him. I'd been concentrating on the pretty girl.
He cut through.
When you talk about a thing called the anointing or the presence of God, I felt it. I felt it in such a dramatic way, and I had to go forwards, and so I did. And that night I lost the girl and found the Lord. So that's how it worked.
So that was 68.
That was 1968, and after I finished a short career in the dairy industry, I went into full-time ministry, and I guess that was between about 1980 and 2009.
Okay.
So a fair slab, and in that time I carried leadership roles at a national, an international, and a state and a local level. So there's I'm not saying that to boast.
No.
Every time I think about it, I think, how much weight did you carry? No wonder. Now I've written a book called Stress Less, Live More, and I can look back and understand the kind of stress that was involved in that. Like, I'm blessed to be able to serve the Lord, but maybe I'd have been wiser if I'd read my own book before I wrote it. That's a silly thing to say, isn't it?
I'm looking forward to reading that one as well. I think we can all do it a little less stress.
Oh, well, everybody's got stress. It's about managing it. And our topic today is grief.
Yeah.
And the reason I wrote that book is because grief is possibly the most acute form of stress a person will ever experience.
Absolutely.
If you really love the person, it's either grief or relief.
Yeah. And it heightens the more you love.
Yeah.
The more it's heightened.
So I was in church leadership for all those years.
So 2009.
2009, I resigned from all forms of leadership and hadn't prepared for the future. I didn't realise that the human race was going through a longevity revolution.
What do you mean by longevity revolution?
Well, the retirement age is generally known as 65. That's when a person, not anymore, but that's when a person normally was given a pension.
Sure.
If they qualified for one. The question is, when was 65 set as the retirement age or the age at which you could get a pension? Have you got any idea about that? Have a guess.
70s?
1908.
There you go. Way off.
And the average life expectancy was 58. So if you lived an extra 7 years to 65,
you could retire.
You could actually get a small pension that tided you over to the funeral.
Sure.
And now, of course, well, Paul Keating brought in compulsory superannuation, and that was to see us to the age of 75. But the average life expectancy now is 83 and 84. So,
And with the pace at which things are moving, that will increase, or should increase, by the way people are starting to think about looking after themselves.
And that was the challenge that I had. I was totally unprepared for the future beyond resignation. I never saw myself retiring, but I could see myself resigning and transitioning. It's just that I hadn't prepared for it, and I didn't realise that I had all these years left to live and pay for. So that equals stress. And so I began to, I had to learn a lot very quickly. And from that moment on, I began to mentor leaders at all different business people, but mainly church leaders. It was so funny. I used to ask the Lord, please, give me some really big sinners. Like I would ask him. Give me the worst of the worst. Give me the worst of the worst. I love sinners. I remember acutely what kind of a sinner I was. And I used to think, sometimes I used to think I loved the company of sinners more than I loved the company of Christians.
There you go.
It's crazy. What a thought. And I love Christians, but sinners, ooh.
Something juicy there.
They get you excited.
And what did he give you?
gave me church leaders.
Right.
And after a while I thought, God, why have you given me these people to mentor and care for and look after? And a verse came to mind, do good to all men, but especially those who are of the household of faith. And the pressure, the tension, the grief, the stress that people in leadership, and it's a unique leadership world because it's a volunteer leadership theme.
Yeah, for the most part.
Yeah. There aren't many people on staff, but you've got to mobilise a volunteer army. So you've got to run on inspiration, not expectation for money exchange for the work.
So that's been sort of the last decade plus.
I've fallen into that. I've loved it. I've written, I've just written another 2 small books. But so now I suppose I've written 6 or 7 books. I'm an author. Yeah. I'm a mentor, and I used to do workshops which stopped with COVID, but have just started up again. So I don't know where that'll go, but
yeah, I'm excited. Maybe we can talk a little bit about those as well today.
Yeah.
When we bumped into each other a couple of months back, you know, I'd heard word or caught wind that you'd returned to our church, and we'd met previously years before when you were doing a circuit of Australia. And, you know, I could clearly remember yourself and Tula, your wife. And then, I heard news that Tula had passed. And so that's what I came and bumped into you at church and you know, mentioned my condolences. And you said something to me that has single-handedly changed just the way I think on many dimensions. Do you remember what you said?
No, I don't.
You know, I just mentioned, you know, my condolences, and you said, you know, don't worry, I'm the happiest bloke you'll meet here today. You know,
well, that sounds like me, honestly.
And we were standing in a room full of 300 people, you know, and it's a pretty bold statement. Where does that come from?
I'd probably change the word happiest to richest.
Sure.
These days. Maybe I'll write another book called The Richest Man on Earth, because it comes from walking with God through what people often call the valley. You know, valleys and mountaintops.
Yeah.
And valleys are often described as the hard places, the dark places. But just think about it for a second. Like, there are great valleys in the Bible. Psalm 84 has got a great valley in it. And it says people walk through it with tears, but they come out the other end rejoicing.
Wow.
And in life, the valleys are the fertile places.
It's where we grow, where we're stretched.
Well, that's where the rivers are. That's where the river flats are. That's where the beef are. That's where the crops are. That's where people compete with each other to buy a piece of real estate.
That's amazing.
That's not going on the mountaintops. All you get on a mountaintop is a great view.
Right.
So finding God in the valleys and a la Psalm 84, going through the valley of weeping, but coming out the other side, having met God in a whole new way. I share with you one verse, can I?
Yeah.
Which I conveniently used to leave the last piece off because I didn't like the sound of it.
How common is that?
Yeah,
We've all done it.
Yeah. It was that I might know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. And I used to think, that doesn't sound right. And yet I've come to realise now that you can't really plumb the depths of your relationship with God apart from suffering.
Wow.
It's in the plan.
So
it's just that we don't even think God's written it into the plan, and therefore we don't expect it.
So it's vital to our relationship.
Vital, absolutely necessary. I mean, after my first wife passed away, I was talking to a really good friend of mine, Jeff Woodward, who's, I think, the vice president of INC. And we're having a meal together in Sydney once, and he said, "How's your relationship with God?" And I hadn't been asked that question. And I said, I said, you know how it really is? I'm always looking over my shoulder for the next smack that God's going to give me that I don't think I've deserved. Because my first wife, Marilyn, was 52 years of age. And, you know, I've heard people say when somebody's 65 that I was too young. So there's never a good age to die, especially for the people who survive.
Yeah.
You know, and so I just came to the realisation.
So you hadn't realised that you felt like God was looking to smack you at the next.
Well, exactly.
Next corner.
I'll tell you what happened. God had gone from being a trusted father, somebody who could be relied on to protect you and care for you and love you, to somebody who is now an unpredictable ally.
Yeah, wow. And it just happened in that moment that you realised.
That moment of realisation just got me back on course again. I went home and did some pretty big business with God and thought, well, I need to know who you really are now that you do allow difficulties, like severe difficulties in people's life. I once went back to him and I said, who knew that pruning would be so severe? You know, a little snip here and there, that's okay. But taking the chainsaw and cutting off all the big limbs of a tree, that's a bit savage.
Yeah. So let's talk then about, you mentioned Marilyn. I mentioned Tula. How do you like to unpack this story when you've talked on grief, heavily in small groups, in congregations, in your book?
Sure.
How do you like to unpack this to give everybody listening, I guess, a bit of a understanding as to your journey in terms of love and grief?
I think I've unpacked it differently as time's gone by, as you go from strength to strength and from a better perspective to a higher perspective than that. And these days I unpack it like this, that we all form the closest of relationships, and one of the definitions of grief, which I happen to love, is the cost of loving someone.
Yeah.
Like you and Kaylee here, you're deeply in love, you're about to go into a new season of your life and you're about to have a beautiful baby, and how close could you get to a person other than in a situation like this? And yet here we are. Now, I'm a Pentecostal kind of a Christian, and one of the weaknesses of Pentecostal Christianity is that we always triumph the victories and the miracles and the healings.
Yeah.
But we belong to a God. I know this isn't popular Pentecostal theology, but we belong to a God who promises healings and miracles and guarantees death.
Whew. So massive. Promises, healings and miracles, and guarantees death.
And we have to balance that tension. We've got to come to grips with this thing. And so these days when I look back on my two wives and my daughter, who was 32, I think, when she departed for wonderful shores, I just think to myself, what a privilege it is that we can share in somebody else's life so deeply and be a main reason or a large reason why they get to heaven.
Yeah.
Like I was talking to a friend the other day whose wife has severe Alzheimer's, and I said to him, I called him by name, it is the plan of God that everybody should die and go to heaven. It's not just it's God's plan for everybody to go to heaven. It's everybody's plan. It's God's plan for everybody to die and go to heaven. And I could see the wheels ticking and oh yeah, that's right.
And I think, you mentioned this in your book, that you had a solicitor at one point who you walked into his office and he was kind of shocked standing there, and you asked him why. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, sure. Marilyn, my first wife, and I had gone to do our will. And so we ended up at the solicitor's office, and he was shaken. When we entered his office, it was our turn, so we went into his office. And I said, Michael, what's wrong? Oh, he said, I just had a lady in and she'd been told she only had 6 months to live. And, I always depend on God to help me. I mean, I've said lots of wrong things and I've come up with the wrong, things that aren't helpful. But on this occasion, I got the right thing. And I said to him, Michael, how many people are in the room here now? And, of course, it was a no-brainer. He said, well, there's 3. I said, and how many of us are dying? And, he didn't say anything. He just leant back in his big leather chair and had a little weep. Actually, a few tears came out of his eye. Now, after a while, he just lifted up his head and he said, thank you. And I knew why he was saying thank you, because one of the things I do with people, and maybe I've done it already here today, is bring perspective.
You're always bringing perspective.
So
I love about you.
So that people understand the parameters, the shifting parameters of life.
And I've got a big smile on my face, like, as you tell the story, because it's such a reminder to all of us. We're all dying. We're all dying.
Isn't that incredible?
And that's God's plan, like you mentioned, that it's guaranteed that we would die and then be with him. And we don't walk through life thinking about that.
Well, let's unpack that in just a further way. It is true, but the bigger truth than that is what Jesus said to Martha, I think it was, when he came to raise Lazarus from the dead, where she said, look, if you'd have come earlier, he wouldn't be dead now.
That's right.
You could have fixed this. And, of course, a grieving woman or man has no filters.
That's right.
It wasn't, dear Lord, it was, if you'd have been here.
You're late.
That's right. But his answer was, if anyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And to make, because he was revved up about to raise somebody from the dead after 4 days, like he'd been in heavy duty intercession, and he added to that, do you believe this? Like, I don't want to shout into the microphone, but the strength of his conviction would have been amazing, because the master of life was about to destroy death a couple of moments later when he called Lazarus out of the tomb. And I can remember when I stood at Tula's funeral before the coffin was about to be lowered into the grave, I turned to everybody that had come and I said, you've got to understand that Jesus said that if you live and believe in him, you never die. And so, the body of my beautiful wife is in that box behind me, but she's not here.
Yeah.
And so, even though you do die, your body dies, isn't that beautiful news? That your spirit and soul simply migrate or transition or metamorphose, whatever word you want to use, into his presence.
And on that, you mention Paul in your book and writing in regards to being absent here and present there. Can you share a little bit about that? Because I think that relates directly to what you just mentioned with Tula.
Well, it kind of speaks for itself in a way, but one of the verses from Hebrews 12 that always I just love it to bits. Whoever wrote Hebrews, and it was either Paul or somebody that knew Paul really well, I reckon.
Sure.
But he said, when you pray, that's on my in brackets bit, you don't come to a mountain like Moses, the mountain Moses went up when he got the 10 Commandments. You come to a heavenly mountain, Mount Zion, and you come to the Father, the God, the judge of all mankind, the blood of Jesus. But one of it, he says, you come to the spirits of those made perfect. And that's my first and second wife. That's my daughter.
Right.
Yeah. And so that enormous sense. I had one person, when I talk like this all the time to people, and I've had people say to me, you've really got a take on eternity, haven't you? And, one of my favourite characters in the Bible is Enoch, because one day he was praying and wandered into the realm of the spirit where God lives, and
the next minute
and couldn't find his way home again. And so God probably said to him, well, you have no earthly use, you might as well stay here.
Something else that really caught my attention in the book was in regards to this idea of carrying and then also being carried. And I think with with everyone in our world that's experiencing grief or about to, they're anticipating grief, sometimes, you just feel like, woe is me, and I just need to be held and helped. But can you talk a little bit about the idea of the stretcher? And 4 out of 5 times you'll be carrying somebody else.
Let me tell you when that happened. I was going for the first time without my wife to a national executive conference at, was it Legends Hotel on the Gold Coast or something like that. And I was at the bottom of the stairs, that took you up to the front door of the hotel. And I was caught in a time warp. I didn't know whether to turn and run or whether to go up there as a single man, because everybody else had their wife.
Okay, and this was after
Marilyn's death.
Your first wife, yes.
And Mark Ramsey, who's the senior pastor of City Point, and Jeff Woodward, who, they were there, and they must have seen me in my dilemma, and they ran down the stairs, got either side of me, and basically frog marched me up the stairs.
Got you up there.
Yeah, because where was I going to run to?
Totally.
Into depression, obviously, into some place of
isolation,
and there's the big weakness. That's the common thing we do, and the worst thing that we can do. Anyway, Danny Guglielmucci was the speaker at our conference. He'd come to inspire the oversight, and he mentioned about the four guys that carried their mate on the stretcher. And it changed my life when he summarised it by saying, 4 times out of life, you'll have to carry somebody, or you'll be carrying somebody else's stretcher. 1 time out of 5, it'll be your turn to get on the stretcher. And the implication was, when it's your turn, make sure you get on it.
Yeah, don't miss it.
Don't miss it, because that's when you need your mates and you need people. Because the most instinctive thing to do at a time of great grief is to isolate.
It's to retreat.
You see it in nature that wounded animals crawl up hollow logs and either die or get better, but they isolate. When, who was it, the guy who ran for president of the United States once, but he was a war hero from the Vietnam War, and had been 5 years in a Vietnamese prison. He said the worst torture they inflicted on him was solitary confinement. Wow. That was the worst of all that they did to him, trying to get secrets from him. And another word for that is isolation.
Yeah, and to think that we do that to ourselves.
Well, as if we haven't been belted enough, by losing people that we have given our whole heart and mind and soul and strength to.
Yeah.
And then we make it worse by flogging ourselves with isolation. It doesn't make sense, but we do it.
Yeah. To jump back a little bit, I didn't realise the first experience, or maybe it's the first, maybe I'm wrong, the first experience you had with grief was when you were actually 18.
Yeah.
And that was your dad.
That was my dad.
So what happened there?
I've been through about, 12 seasons of grief now. Wow. You've only got to live long enough to have that happen. If people start counting, they'll realise they've been through a few too.
Yeah, we've had that realisation.
Yeah.
Wow, there's actually loads of people that we've lost along the way.
Yeah.
Some much closer than others, and so, you think of them more often. But tell us, about your dad, and do you feel like, was that your first experience of hard personal grief? It
was, and I had no idea what I was going through. My dad was a squadron leader in the Second World War, and somebody who he's my greatest hero and role model.
I love that.
But I never knew him because he came back from the war with PTSD.
Wow.
And so he had no capacity to father children. He could sire children, but he couldn't father them. And it wasn't till later on, after when I wrote the book on stress, that I realised what my father was going through.
Wow. How many years later was that?
Well, that was 1968, a couple of years after, a couple of weeks rather, after I left school and went to Hawkesbury Agricultural College. That was 1968.
So we're talking like 40, 30...
Well, I wrote the book in about 2015 or 16, something like that. And only then did I realise, oh my Lord, what did my poor father, what did he go through? He won the war and lost the peace.
Yeah. I think that just goes to show how the timeline of what we experience and what we understand, it can be quite long.
When I was writing the book Grieve Upwards, I've written a chapter in there which describes a river with many tributaries, because I was raised in big river country. Grafton is on the mighty Clarence River, and our home was right on the river bank, so when it flooded, you saw everything come past, all the hyacinth that was washed out of the creeks and tributaries. There were logs and jetties and boats and cattle and everything just washed out. And it, floods are a way of cleaning all the tributaries. And suddenly, when I started to get in touch with a grieving process, when I began to intentionalise my grieving process, which I got to say is the only time when you really start to grieve.
Sure. And for you, when was that? When did you start to intentionalise grief?
After Marilyn died, when I was about 57.
Sure. And she passed in what year?
2003.
Okay. And so how long after 2003 then did you start to intentionalise? Or really look at the grief? Because I know you went through a number of years of isolation.
No, it was immediately after.
Oh, immediately?
Yeah, immediately. I had a family then. I had 3 kids and one was married. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, how do you do this? Because I was also a state chairman and presiding over 60-something churches.
Yeah.
And I thought, how do I stay strong? What do? I don't know how to do this journey. So I rang a large church, and I thought, large church, large resources, and they mentioned a thing called Grief Share, a program which you could purchase from America. And so I bought that, and I gathered my family together every Monday night.
And you guys processed?
And, well, all the cholerics, all the big D personalities know that the only time to get something done is now, whether you're ready for it or not. So I just decided I'd have everybody process their grief immediately they'd lost somebody.
Yeah.
So I suppose 6 or 7 weeks after Marilyn died, I learned how to cook a baked dinner and an apple crumble.
Very handy.
Yeah. And we got them around, and everybody processed it at their own pace. But I particularly learned, because you got a workbook and you had things to do every day. And as I intentionally did this program, I realised, the thought occurred to me, I've intentionalised my process.
Right.
I'm not just waiting for God moments or other moments to come and kind of help me go to the next place.
You have gone on to teach or take people through Grief Share.
Not Grief Share as such,
right?
Because
was it your own?
Oh no, I have done the Grief Share course with others on 2 or 3 times, but it hasn't been a regular thing.
Okay.
These days, if especially church leaders, if they lose a loved one, and it happens, I have the privilege of walking with some of them through, especially the first year of their grieving journey. But it's not just to help them get through grief; it's to get them back to strength and purpose and their course again.
I mean, that's why we exist, to provide hope and then see people go from strength to strength. What are some of those things that you walk them through in those early days? of grief. And is it different? Do you find it's different for everybody, or do you feel there is some? It's structured, but it's loosely held.
No, everybody's different. I mean, the answer is yes to both of those, because there are generalisations that apply to everybody, but everybody still has to walk their own individual journey. And so in those early days, I mean, one of the first things you help people do is not isolate, but also forgive the people that came to the funeral, you know, who were all there for you between the death and the funeral, and then deserted you the day after.
Later.
Caught their planes and buses and trains home.
No more text messages or calls or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you go from being engulfed in...
surrounded by people and outpourings of love, support.
But then after that, like, if a person is a Christian, this is what they can expect. They can expect God to provide for them one or two or maybe another, but a grieving person doesn't need a party. They don't need 100 people around them. They need somebody who will say to them, I am here for you in the journey to whatever depth and for however long it takes.
Amazing.
And that's the commitment that I give to people that I have the privilege of walking with. And so I say to them, look, forgive all the ones that say, I call it the Pentecostal backslap. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Maybe.
It's people saying, praying for you,
yes.
You know, like giving you the backslap, praying for you. And you know they're not.
Yeah.
And you've got to forgive those people because they're not the people God has provided to walk the journey with you. And God's keen. He will come through every time with you for this if you'll let him.
Totally.
Yep.
Totally. And so you've often been that person for others, but how does someone approach people to be that person for them? How do they get people around them that are going to walk the journey with them?
It is an exercise in discovery, but normally speaking, you can see the ones who are really taking you seriously. And you don't just want anybody. Do you remember when Job's comforters came to him?
That's right.
The first thing they did was sit there with him and say nothing.
7 days they just sat.
And they would have been very wise to stay there for the next 3 months and say nothing. Because everything that came out of their mouth after that wasn't particularly helpful.
And I think it actually says that they went to support him and give advice. And when they saw him from a distance and they saw his grief, they tore their clothes, and that's when they took that vow of silence just to sit in the grief.
In the grief workshop that I do, I've got one section called Traps During Grief. And 3 of the points on top of each other. The first one is beware the person with good intentions. The second one is beware the person with good intentions and advice. And the third one is beware of all the other people with good intentions and advice.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what a person's going through. Your job is to provide a place for them to talk. And you can only understand their journey if you listen. We don't have advice for other people. We have comfort for people.
That's
and
awesome.
The last time I looked, the Holy Spirit was the great comforter. That's why it's good to talk to him, because he's a really good listener.
So on that point of talking to the Holy Spirit and prayer, it's not, for some people it's the first thing they turn to after loss. But for many that I know, and I know within our family unit, that was difficult for a lot of our family to pray to a God that loves us but has taken away or allowed, our loved one to die. You talk about it in terms of getting in the slipstream of prayer, finding somebody else that knows how to pray and slotting in behind them. Is that something that you would recommend, from...
When you've got a situation that's developing, there's sudden trauma and there's growing trauma. The growing trauma has been my experience on all three occasions of my immediate loved ones dying. They were diagnosed. We prayed, we fasted, we wanted a different result. We did everything we knew to do. We exercised as much faith as we had, and they still went home.
So that's a growing trauma.
That's a growing trauma.
I've never heard it put like that, but I love that.
Or a developing trauma, if you like.
Yeah.
And before my first wife passed away, and this made it easy for me to find the person who would walk with me because they were committed to me in that developing trauma. They would come to my house, and this particular man was a great man of faith and still is.
So it wasn't just intention, it was actually showing up and putting that to work in the process.
Absolutely it was. We'd formed a relationship during the pre-grieving stage of grief, and so he stuck with me afterwards, so it was fairly easy, and that's been my story every time.
And
but let me just go on, because I got so weak during the pre-grieving towards the place where my mate was going to go home that I found no strength to pray. And I just thought it was so important what you said, that the majority of the people are not full of strength and faith at a time like that. We need the strength and faith in other people. I mean, that's where the Holy Spirit lives, so why wouldn't you take advantage of it?
That's great.
So, God showed up in human form for me, and then after my mate passed away...
And just to clarify, mate, you're meaning your wife?
Yeah.
Just... Because we call people mates, and there's obviously, your mate as in your partner, your wife,
yeah, my
helpmate.
Yeah. And there were times afterwards. One of the chapters in the book is entitled "God, You're a Wife Killer."
Absolutely.
So
it's a pretty strong chapter title.
Well, it's real. And lots of people would understand that.
Absolutely.
We want to give people permission not to put on a brave face, but to be authentic and real through this process. It's okay. God understands the difference between an accusation and a cry of pain. That was my cry of pain.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear anything back from God. He didn't correct my theology or, no, I'm, impotent. And no, that's not the right word.
Omnipotent?
I thought he was impotent.
Right.
I said it on purpose, but I thought, where on earth are you, God?
Yeah, that's right.
He didn't come and correct my theology. He just loved me through it. And so I had him, and then I had my friend.
Yeah.
One friend in particular was enough for me because I felt like I could just, awesome. Just empty. I could download and vent and do whatever I like. And my friend was a person who had an opinion about everything, and somehow he just knew to listen.
He zipped it.
No matter how much grief was playing with the chemistry in my brain, how wrong I was, how wrong my take on God was.
Wow.
I mean, that was the story about the lady that came to one of our grief share groups.
Yeah, I love this story so much. It gives me, I just relate so much to her. Would you mind sharing that?
She came along. This is after I'd remarried. Tula and I decided we'd help everybody that we could.
Yeah.
And she came along and she said, life sucks. This is our small group. Life sucks. And I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. She said, I don't think God cares about me at all. And I said, oh. And then she said, in fact, I don't think he even exists. And all the other people in the room had suddenly become expert theologians.
They got their Bibles
ready. You could
ready.
see them reaching for their Bibles and scriptures to correct this person. I said, stop. I said, it's official. God doesn't exist. And of course, what was I doing?
Validating her
right to process her grief in that moment at that pace.
The way that she knows how.
That's right.
That's different to everybody else.
And after about 30 minutes, it was incredible. You know, I've never seen such a miracle. God existed again.
I love that.
God went from non-existence back to existence, and it's all because we just said, yeah, you've got the right to go. Look, I've had people revert to all kinds of language, and, you know, I just sit there and smile and listen to it all. And, you know, after a while, maybe after 3 or 4 weeks, I ask them, is the language helping them all that much anymore?
Yeah.
You know?
What do you tend to hear back?
Yeah, just to... But always validate a person's privilege, if you like, of grieving, and be there for them, so that when they can't find God, well, here's God in me. Yeah. The third member of the Godhead lives in us. Mm-hmm. And if we listen long enough, and, you know, we might be able to say one thing in an hour that a person could take away as help. But mostly people counsel themselves in grief if you're a good listener.
Most people counsel themselves in grief if you're a good listener.
Yeah.
Yeah, expand on that.
Well, that lady, for example, you know, we just listened to her for the next 30 minutes. And she turned herself around and came back to a place where she said, oh, I know it's just been a bad day.
Yeah, wow.
You know, I know I'm in grief.
I think that's an interesting point. Just being able to identify those bad days and calling them as it is, especially early in grief.
Yeah. And
identifying the good ones. And maybe it's not even a good day. Maybe it's a good moment, you know, because it is moment by moment. One moment happy, one moment sad, angry. And just declaring those wins in small doses is helpful, but also identifying, hey, today sucked.
What really helped with the Grief Share course, and I would recommend it to anybody because it helped me so much, but on the 7th day, you do a little exercise every day in a workbook. Did you rest
on the 7th day?
Yeah, pretty much. But on the 7th day, it's a stock take. What happened this week?
All right.
And it gives you a kind of like a checklist. Okay. How'd you go with this? How'd you go with that? What happened here? What happened there? And some weeks you can summarise it by saying, oh, things are looking really up. You know, I've had a really good week for a change. And then the next week you get to the 7th day next week and say, oh, well, that didn't work. You know, like it was obviously 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And but it gave you an opportunity to kind of monitor your progress
and just check
forwards,
in.
Which was check in, and it really helped.
So you've been on the cancer journey 3 times now with 3 of the closest people in your world. Can we talk about Belinda for a little? Would you mind sharing her story? You got 3 kids?
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm so looking forward to seeing her again.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And tell us about Belinda.
Belinda was born with a condition called Alagille syndrome, and it just had multiple things that could go wrong. She ended up becoming the face of RPA. Remember that TV program, RPA?
Yeah.
She became the face of the organ transplant part of the program. We were told that she wouldn't live past the age of 2. And then we realised after time that everybody who has this syndrome has to have a liver transplant at some point in their life, normally before the age of 10. So we just kept trusting God, and she was 28 when she had a liver transplant. And up until then, she could never dream of anything like a long life or a marriage or children. In fact, after she had the liver transplant, a young man who is a son to me now, he couldn't see Alagille syndrome at all.
Wow.
He just saw the beauty in this life, and we all knew that Belinda was hard work. Well, if you got to wake up every day and live off half the energy everybody else
you
have
mean
to live.
Not hard work by personality, hard work by physicality.
Physicality and personality.
Okay.
She had to fight to be victorious every day, and it just sapped the energy out of her life.
What a fighter.
Every now and again, Matt would come to me and say, well, she's not meant to behave like that. And I would say to him, Matt, You have no idea what it's like to be Belinda. Anyway, she had a liver transplant, and this guy fell in love with her. They had 15 months where they packed about 10 years of love into 15 months of marriage. And then cancer hit because she was on drugs that lowered her immune system to retain the organ that had been transplanted into her body. And within about 2 weeks, she was in heaven.
Is that right? 2 weeks was the...
Yeah.
Wow. How...
Right on 32nd birthday.
Oh, how do you, after losing Marilyn to cancer, then get hit with the news that Belinda, after all she's made it through to 31, 32, and then receive that news? How do you process that? How do you do business with God on that? Where were you at that moment?
Can you remember what Psalm 84 says about people who go through that valley? Is there any recollection there? I'm not trying to catch you off guard.
That they come out rejoicing.
Yeah, there's a phrase in there. The answer is yes to what you're saying. They go from strength to strength. Now, you would think that people who go through multiple griefs would go from weakness to weakness. But if you find God in the middle of it, He's got a way of strengthening you in your weakness. Like today, I'd have to say I feel weaker than I've ever been, and yet the strength that I bring to other people's lives is incredible.
Totally.
I'm an observer of this, and I'm probably the epitome of let the weak say I'm strong. Because somehow, as I've decreased, He's increased. Somehow, as I've grown weaker over the years through all of these debilitating experiences, He's grown stronger. And so when it came time, we were a family together in RPA in the a room, was it the emergency section or wherever we were, where it was definitely an emergency. And I just had the strength to minister to all my family and to everybody that came into the room. So people that came in to minister to us walked out being ministered to because the strength of God was there.
Yeah.
I tell you, Ryan, I've tried to become a really good student of life's experiences. I have a philosophy that goes like this: if I have to pay a big price for something, I want to know what I've bought.
That's great. Yeah, I agree with that.
Because all of those big lessons, they're either going to smash you or weaken you, or you're going to come out of them having learned how to walk with God, having learned more about the Lord, being able to embrace your relationship with Him in a more intimate and deeper way. So I think that's the answer to it, really.
Yeah, I love it. And it's a massive price to pay, losing the ones that we love. But knowing what we've bought or signed up for or said yes to, that gives me so much hope.
Yeah.
I mean, you said it. You can't wait to be with Belinda again.
We clashed. We were the same personality.
Right?
But I know when we see each other, it's going to be that we made it through the minefield. I call life a minefield.
It is. It totally is.
Yeah.
You really, you shared a really pivotal moment, I think, with Belinda's journey when the nurse asked you about switching things off. It was you and your son-in-law, Belinda's husband. And you said something there that I thought I related to, even though I've never had that question asked of me, when the nurse said, would you be okay to switch? Are you ready? And you said, yes, we were, and no, we weren't.
Who's ready for something like that? And organ donation and the whole thing about, donating and transplanting is just a thing you mostly see on television, and you're generally aware of it because you tick a box when you sign up for your license saying, yes, I'm happy to have my organs donated, and you know.
I think that was the moment in the book where I cried.
Oh wow!
For the first time.
Wow.
Yeah. To be faced with that decision.
There's such big moments. It's almost like an anaesthetic is applied to your soul, and you make it through, but not because you're strong, but because God's got a way of providing you. I mean, we are a chemical factory.
That's right.
And those chemicals are God made. You know, what an incredible body we have, and we have a cocktail of the most amazing hormones on the inside that come to our aid at times like that. Not only the presence of God, but there's a miracle happening within our hormonal and chemical system at the same time. And so when the time came and Rowan and I were there, you know, I'd sometimes the thought had crossed my mind, what must it be like for parents to give permission to have the machines turned off? And then there we were.
In the moment. Right
in the moment. And so it was surreal in a way. The nurse was saying, now I'm turning this off.
Wow.
Now I'm turning that off.
Wow.
Now I'm turning that off. Now I'm turning that off. But at the same time, you know, I've often wondered, I wonder when people leave their bodies.
At what point exactly?
Like I have a friend called Ian McCormack. He's known as the box jellyfish man.
Why is that?
He died. He was scuba diving off Mauritius,
right?
Night diving, and he was stung by a number of box jellyfish at the same time. And in Mauritius, the medical system's nothing to.
I can't imagine it's much.
No,
yeah,
terrible. And anyway, he died. He finally got to hospital. He had to convince a taxi driver to take him there because the medical system is such that if you're caught with a dead person in your taxi, you've got to pay for their funeral and whatever else. So nobody wants to pick up a dying man. You want to leave him on the side of the road. Anyway, he died on the operating table, and he floated out of his body, and he could see the doctors and the nurses rushing around and then finally saying he's gone and beginning to take the needles out of his body. And, you know, and then he had this spiritual experience and came back into his body and lived again. And, of course, that was mayhem in this little Mauritian hospital. You know, they freaked out. So I often wonder when people do leave their bodies and go to be with the Lord. Maybe it's not at the moment that they breathe their last breath.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, because what's the Bible say? It says, precious in the sight of God is the death of his godly ones, which is a bit of a two-sided coin, you know, like God's looking at his kids and saying, look, another one's come home. And we're all standing around a dead body saying, oh,
another one's gone.
Bummer. You know, oh, I'm gutted. So precious in the sight of God is the death of his godly ones, and horrible in the sight, you know, painful beyond description in the sight of the loved one standing around the dead body that they loved is the death of the godly one.
Yeah. To change thoughts, you've got this idea that you like to use that grief shouldn't happen to us. We should happen to grief. Tell me about that. Where does that come from?
Well, it's probably more about something we talked about before. It's all about the whole thought of intentionality. If you just let grief roll over you, there's a chance, and I've met people like this who 10, 15 years later are still talking about the death of their loved one as if it happened yesterday. One story. I ran a workshop, we call it Permission to Hope these days. The pastor said, why don't you come to the church and preach the week before so that people get a feel for you and see whether they would come to the workshop. And a young guy came up to me, a young dad, with his wife, and he said, "Oh, it's really good that you're coming to do the workshop. Nobody's talking about things like that. It's really great that you're coming." And he told me that he'd lost his little boy at the age of 2 years before. So I said, "We'll see you there then." And he said, "Oh, no." Kind of like, "What are you thinking? I've been avoiding this for 2 years. Why would I start now?"
Yeah.
And he did come. And it's a
awesome.
very easy workshop to attend.
Yeah.
It really is. It's very uplifting, and you wouldn't think a thing like that could be so rich. But he wept his way through all the little exercises
Wow.
we give them to do. And at the end, this young guy came up to me, and tears are still coming out of his eyes. And he put his head on my shoulder as if he were a son of a father that he loved. I always remember that because I love being a dad. And he whispered into my ear, "I think I've started my journey."
Wow. That's amazing.
After 2 years, he realised that coming and saying, "Right, I'm going to engage now."
Yeah. He'd ignored it. He'd pushed it aside.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So that's more to do with, so right, I'm ready to
Yeah. Take grief
do it. Yeah.
by the chains and go for it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about remarriage, because after Marilyn died, there was a time before you eventually came to thinking, hey, I do need a mate, as you put it, as a wife.
Yeah.
And I found it fascinating that, I mean, it sounded like you had people accusing you, or, at the time of thinking about getting remarried. Was that the case? There were people there's not supportive of that?
Yeah, totally. It goes back to one of the main differences, another generalisation, can I say, about how men and women grieve differently. Like women are normally emotionally driven, men are ego driven, generally. Ladies in particular don't want to leave their mate, and they stay loyal to their mate.
My mum is still very much married to Dad, even though he died 11 years ago.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
Whereas T.D. Jakes, who understands people like nobody I've ever heard, says 3 weeks after the funeral, often the men go and buy a new coat and a new hat, and they're out in the street.
Right.
Hunting down their prey. I don't think he uses those words, but he's back on the street or on the market or whatever.
Yeah.
And nobody likes being alone.
As we've already said, solitary confinement, one of the worst forms of punishment.
And of course, for a lot of men, now this is very different. I had another guy lose his wife at about the same time, a pastor of a church. He didn't want to think about remarrying and didn't for about 10 years.
Yeah, you are generalising.
I really am.
Yeah.
However, for all of those that hear this or watch this, I'm the marrying kind.
Yeah, that's right.
And I don't like, I like going to bed alone, and I don't like waking up alone, and I like the idea of calling my wife just to hear the sweetness of a lady's voice, and I love that kind of thought. So it goes all the way back to that, and sorry, just repeat the question again so I don't meander.
No, coming after
remarriage,
Marilyn had died,
people sometimes being critical of that.
Yeah, critical against that, not for it.
It wasn't that they were critical. The only people I really had to contend with were my kids.
Right.
And you're a very unwise man if you jump in, or maybe a lady too, if you jump in to a new relationship despite the pain and the havoc that you're causing in your kids' lives.
Right.
They can be one of the big litmus tests on whether or not the relationship that you're enthusiastic about because you just need somebody to fill the gap.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so whenever I was interested in a person, and I was there, I met some ladies along the way, but always the litmus test was for me were the kids ready for me to do something like that. They could never replace their mum anyway. But were they ready to embrace a stepmother?
And you had that conversation with them along the way, and
I included them in every conversation.
Didn't they take you out for a meal sometime?
Yeah, it was about 16 months after Marilyn passed away, and Matt cleared his throat after we'd eaten Italian, and he said, "Well, we've had a talk about it."
The board has had a talk.
Yeah, the board's had a discussion, and we've agreed that if you want to form a relationship with another person, you've got our approval. Now, I might add, years later, I reminded Matt of this. He said, "I can't remember doing that."
Is that right?
I said, "Trust me, mate, you did it."
Yeah. It was much the same for Kaylee and her 3 brothers and their dad after his wife had died. The same thing happened where you guys actually pointed out people for your dad to have a chat with, and so I think that's such a amazing relationship to have with your kids.
I did write down once, I got a big piece of paper and I wrote down the difference. I put a line in the middle and I wrote the difference between what it was, the circumstances of being married for the first time and then the second time. Like, for example, never been married before.
Yep.
No kids. Been married for 30 years, 3 kids.
Yeah.
You start, and the list just went down, and it was just such a different scenario.
So getting married for the second time, it's not like I've done this before. There's a whole bunch of new firsts that come along with that.
And I'll tell you, like, I have been terribly unwise at different times in my life, but this was a moment of wisdom. And I asked the Lord when I was bereaved, but I was maybe, 6 or 8 months into it. I said, if I'm looking for somebody, who am I looking for? And for some reason, I read the book of Ruth. And I looked at Ruth, the person, and I looked at everything in it. I just had an inkling I could have been reading about somebody I was looking for.
Wow.
And so there was a lady that was born in another country, had been married before. I made a list of about 6 or 7 or 8 features. Wisdom came to me when I got the list, and rather than tell everybody in super spiritual fashion, I've just heard from God, I put it up on the shelf knowing that I had every chance of being wrong, being alone, like grief speaking to me, not the Lord.
Sure.
And so I left it up on the shelf, and then one day I met Tula, and I suddenly thought I was right. It was the Lord that had spoken to me.
She was from a foreign land.
But wisdom, well, she was born in Finland.
Yep.
Wisdom says, do not believe everything you think or feel about, especially matters like that, during a
grief.
Season of grief.
That's right.
Find God living in another person, like the Holy Spirit lives in you. And I have people still today, I say to them, I'm thinking of making this decision. What do you think? And if I ask enough people and I get consensus from those people, and they're all filled with the Holy Spirit, I think, wow, that could be what I'm looking at. That could be the answer I'm looking for.
Now, yourself and Tula took people through some of these grief workshops together.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate to meet Tula, and I can still remember her and where we spoke. But she had a sense of humour like no other, I believe. And there was one particular, maybe many, I don't know, grief workshops where she suggested bringing humour into them. And you said to me, and you say it in your book, that grieving people love to laugh.
Yeah.
And I think that's so true. But I think it can be also, maybe for the outside world who haven't experienced grief or are journeying along, maybe it's a bit taboo, like this person, they've just lost someone, they're not looking for humour or laughter.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us about what Tula asked people to bring to the workshop?
Well, it wasn't a workshop, it was a small group.
Right.
And she asked, we set up a night, we always had food when people came, because grieving people live in a bitter world. And before that, they could live in a happy world where they laughed and joked and,
Yeah.
you know, and so feeling a bit of happiness and laughing is kind of like a reminder of what I used to be like and what life could be like in the future. So she asked them all to bring jokes
And specifically
about death.
Death jokes.
Well, how many jokes, you know, like the Irish joke about, you know, my father died. I won't try and put an Irish accent. My father died. He worked at the brewery, but he jumped into a vat of whiskey, and 3 people jumped in to save him, but he bravely fought them off. and it goes on, when he was cremated, they tried to put the fire out, but it lasted for 3 weeks. You know, jokes about death.
Yeah.
The Irish are terrific about joking about the difficult things.
I didn't know that.
In life.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Oh, yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I mean, you know, I think that's just so... You kind of just take a breath and go, oh, you can just... You feel a sense of relief a little when you can just have a joke. How did you find... Because everyone in that small group would have been at different stages. I believe Tula asked them each to bring a death joke and share that.
Yeah.
How did that go down with a group of people? Some would have just lost their loved one.
And laughed and laughed and
awesome.
laughed.
And then they, you know, you guys opened up and they cried.
And then we take them on a roller coaster, these poor people. But really it was good for them.
Yeah.
They had great food, they had a great laugh, and then they engaged with their grieving
and people that
process.
Understood.
Oh,
you know.
You've got to be a member of this club to understand that. You know, I say to people, welcome to the club. It's a horrible club, but welcome to it anyway. We're, we'll do this together.
Yeah.
I do love the joke about the people who are filing past the coffin, and Murphy says to O'Hennessy, why has he got such a big smile on his face? He said, well, he was struck by lightning 8 times, but he thought he's having his photograph taken. They used to laugh at things like that.
Yeah.
So
there's one that we've recently come across, and there's a few people standing about to give their condolences at the funeral. And he says, I get so bad at funerals, I don't know what to say. And his friend says, just say, I'm sorry for your loss and move on. So he walks up to the person and says, I'm sorry for your loss, move on. We need laughter, Yeah, we do. We need laughter. And coming back to those chemicals, it does release all sorts of endorphins in us that help with the process. Doesn't mean we'll laugh continually, and we don't need to be laughing continually at all, but a dose of laughter, it's good medicine.
So good, isn't it? Yeah.
I can remember a friend of mine early in our grief who, he used language that we don't typically, but he could make us laugh, and we wouldn't always laugh at that sort of thing, but in the moment, we just needed that release and that relief, and I'm so grateful for it.
Do you know what? I find that if you're not in the club, you can often use humour in a really bad way. But if you're an insider, if you have done, or like me, still doing, a journey of grief, it's a bit like, the Aboriginal people in Australia call each other blackfellas. Mm-hmm. But if you're not a blackfella, you've done the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And so you've got to be pretty sensitive with humour. If somebody else knows that you're going through grief too and you come out with something funny, they tend to accept it and laugh at it.
When you just
otherwise,
when you don't need to say it, you just get it.
Yeah.
This has been amazing. I just want to close off maybe and get you to share, because we want people to see hope. I think there's been a lot of that throughout just our conversation today. I'd love to know where you are at currently, with everything and what you see for the future, and then maybe some words of hope, or where people might turn to if they're listening to this and they're just in the pits right now and needing a glimpse of hope.
Well, to start at the end of your question, if people are in the pits, it would probably mean they're isolated. I constantly find nowadays when I start to, plummet back into, or slide would be the word, slide back into depression, the first thing I need to do is get hold of somebody.
Sure.
I've got two beautiful people who are my landlords at the moment, and oftentimes I'll say, can we have a cuppa?
Yeah.
I just did that this morning, actually. We're backing out of their driveway, and we've got a special connection. Or I get on the phone to my special, lifelong friend, and I visited him yesterday, and we just sit there and laughed, and just being with somebody. Sometimes we talk about horses, and sometimes we talk about bulls and cattle, and then we suddenly flick into some sort of Bible verse or some revelation we've had from the Word, and then we talk about somebody we don't like, and then we talk about somebody we do like, and
Yeah.
it's intimate conversation. It's you can take your mask off.
That's great.
With those kinds of people, and so especially if you're in the pits, it normally means that you're introverting and introspecting. Don't do that.
That's great.
Find God living in a person that you personally trust. Don't just find a new Christian, for example, who's still 90% world and 10% God.
Yeah.
Or 99% world and 1% God.
Sure.
They're probably not going to help you much. Yeah. But if you can find somebody who, they'll be there somewhere. If you don't know somebody, ask your pastor. Ask somebody you do trust to refer you to somebody.
That's awesome.
Find a godly counsellor who's qualified to talk to you. Find a psychologist.
Yeah.
Go to somebody and get a massage, because, physical touch, even if it's not your love language, it's a major part of marriage and certainly married love.
Yeah.
And you miss out on that instantly when somebody dies.
Yep.
And so get a massage.
That's great.
Go to your grandkids. Let them give you a hug. I've got beautiful relationships with my grandchildren. The ones around me here, 19, 16 and whatever. And I've, I walk in the room, said, righto,
So they've
my arms are out,
yeah.
and they all come and give me a hug. You don't know what
beautiful.
those hugs mean to me.
So that's been a big part of your process. Okay, so if you're in the pits, you're most likely isolating, pulling back. Find somebody who has God in them that you trust and reach out. That's awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
And then what about for you? Right.
And those people, if they're the sort of people that I'm talking about, they're in the Word all the time. They're getting genuine revelation, not shallow stuff. And so they can talk to you about something that's entirely unrelated to grief, but entirely related to living your life in Christ, which is what you're doing in the midst of a grief situation. So they can make you rich without necessarily addressing your challenges.
I love that.
Yeah.
And then for you personally right now, where is Dave Schaeffer at in 2023?
Oh, I've never been here before. It's another journey of discovery. Tula passed away July 2022, and it's now December 2023. So it's 15 months, I guess. Is that right? 17 months?
Yep.
17 months. And some days are really ordinary. But I've told you what I do.
Yeah.
In those days,
yeah.
I'm going to happen to my grief. I'm not going to let it happen to me very long before I do something about it. Going forwards, I'm continuing to write. I just wrote a booklet called How to Lead Prayer Meetings, because there's a million books written on prayer, but nothing really written on how to lead a prayer meeting. I've written another one called The Indispensable Apostle, and these have got nothing to do with grief, but the projects of doing something creative make you feel alive. They make you feel young and alive. That's why engaging with whatever purpose you're capable of carrying, and that's what I'm doing right now, they tend to keep me alive and keep me excited and keep me going forwards. And for the bits and pieces of my journey that I don't know about, like what do people say, would you get married again? And
have you been asked that question?
Yeah. Because I'm still the marrying kind.
Totally.
But I'm 74.
Yeah.
So when do you call it quits? When have you had enough? You know, if you marry at 74, you're guaranteeing that you're going to give somebody a funeral.
Yeah, wow. And that list would be different again. First marriage, second marriage, third marriage.
If there was a third marriage.
Right. Sure.
Do I want to give somebody a problem? You know, I've had health challenges. Do I want to give somebody that?
Wow.
It's not like giving them a strong 24-year-old body or a semi-strong 56 or 7-year-old body. Now you've got a 74-year-old body that visits the doctor regularly to manage your health. And I imagine everybody my age has some kind of health issue they're battling with, because God guarantees death. And, you know, if I think, what is it, from the age of 20, your cells are multiplying at a slower rate?
That's right. Yeah, somewhere there. Yeah, we won't put the science to people, but somewhere, you know, we peak and then we start to age.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So I'm just there waiting on God, trusting Him, staying in the Word. I love where I live because I walk along a beach and
it's a
I walk with
spot.
my feet in the ocean, and I've got my Bible out on the phone, and I just talk to Him all the time.
Well, Dave, I know Kaylee and I are richer for knowing you, and I'm excited for this relationship to grow. I feel like I've known you for a long time, but I think also grief does that when we meet and connect with people.
Can I say I feel a great chemistry with you guys as well? It's easy to love you guys.
Hey, well, it takes one to know one. So,
yeah, sure.
Would you mind praying us out of this episode?
Sure, I'd love to. Amen. Amen. Lord Jesus, how grateful we are that you said, despite experiences and feelings we go through, you said you'd never leave us. You also said you'd never fail us. And Lord, for those people out there that are going through one of life's harder and deeper experiences, and they're trying to make sense of the whole picture of their life, and all the time being able to hold up just one piece of the jigsaw and not being able to see the whole story, I pray that you will give them the strength and the grace and the help and the right people to come alongside them, so that they can go through this experience and back to a place of strength and health, and they would that you'd grace them with patience, so that they can wait for the provision of God to come at exactly the right time. God, that you'd strengthen them every day, and that they'd find strength not only from you individually, but from people who you've raised up to be a blessing to them. Father, thank you. Thank you that you always come through. Thank you that you always lift us. Thank you that there's always a dawn to a new day. And I pray for everybody in this place that they would find it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. I hope you've been blessed by this episode. And if you have, and it's resonated with you, we just ask that you share it with somebody else that maybe is on the journey, that could be touched by Dave's story and everything, the wisdom, the gold that's been shared here. So thanks for joining us on this episode of Good Grief, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.
Bye.